Hello and welcome everyone. This is Active Inference GuestStream 77.1. We're here with Gareth Stubbs, going to be discussing the police hunch. So, Gareth, thank you very much for joining. Looking forward to your presentation and the discussion we'll have.
Thank you so much for having me, Daniel, and it's an absolute pleasure to be on the stream, one that I've watched many times, and it's a privilege to be able to talk through the paper. I'm hoping to give you a little bit of background as to why I wrote the paper, where I've come from, a little bit of history, talk through the paper itself, and then hopefully take some interesting questions if there's anybody watching, or from Daniel himself, who's always got some very insightful questions to ask. So if you're all right, Daniel, am I okay to start and get going? Yeah, okay. So a little bit of background. So I'm a relatively new academic. I was a police officer for 18 years in the UK. I was in a Northern English force, and during my career I did a wide range of stuff, from like frontline emergency response, blue lights, to community policing, which is building relationships with the community, gathering intelligence, and then working on long-term problem solving, through to working in national strategy. I worked for the College of Policing and more latterly the Home Office at the Inspectorate. And the Inspectorate was an organisation where we would inspect police officers and make sure that the standards of policing and how they recorded and monitored and all that was up to a particular level. And for the last 5 years of my policing career, I was studying a part-time PhD on the side. And you would think, with me having written this paper, it would be in police decision making or similar, and it wasn't. I actually studied using two theories, which were representative bureaucracy and social embeddedness, and it was actually about how new police recruits navigated the police recruitment process via the use of their social networks. It sounds complicated and convoluted, and it was. I essentially spent a lot of time trying to figure out how people gained advantage or disadvantage through their current social networks whilst trying to get into the police, with the hope of figuring out why our recruitment process was so discriminatory. And I've been working on publishing from that PhD. I've only just finished, actually, over this last maybe 2-3 years, whereupon I went out to the Middle East to teach police officers. Now, there's two people that I want to discuss during this stream, the first being two different groups of people. The first one being Professor Friston, who was just amazing when I contacted him, and the other being two very well-known criminologists called Ken Pease and Jason Roach. And this entire lane or path of study came out of a discussion with them, because I was talking about very strange decision making that you make while in service. So you make decisions that other people look at and say, oh, that's a very strange decision. Why did that police officer make that decision? But when you speak to the officer, they're often able to relate quite a complicated series of past experiences that have led to the decision that they've made. And it was Ken Pease, who's again a very well-known criminologist, who said to me, look, you need to read about the Bayesian brain. He said, look, what you're describing is how the Bayesian brain works, you know. So he set me on this kind of down the rabbit hole journey, if you like, and did a lot of reading of the foundational papers around the Bayesian brain, which I found very complicated because I didn't have a background in mathematics or neuroscience or cognitive science. So it was kind of like jumping in the deep end. But he recommended a really good book called Super Forecasters by Tetlock. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have heard about it, but it's essentially the human art of prediction, like how intuition is made in the Bayesian brain. And I found the book revelatory because when I look back at my police experience, I could see the development of my Bayesian brain as time went on and how my decision making changed. And this was like kind of mixed, because we all have our backgrounds and our history. But when I was at the Home Office in London and we were looking at the way that police forces were organised and governed and all that sort of thing, we could see that there was a general tendency towards this kind of promotion of the generalist. So a lot of your senior managers seem to have been able to like bounce around the organisation. They've done lots of different things. Some have been detectives, some have been uniformed, some have been in corporate, some have been firearms. You had all these different like kind of disciplines, if you like. And you ended up with a lot of senior leaders who were jack of all trades and essentially masters of none. And this was in direct contrast to a lot of the research that looked at, teams of specialists, people with specialist knowledge that have built up very, very solid, what you could call like Bayesian building blocks when it comes to specialist decision making. And then when you put them together, the matching of all these specialisms then resulted in higher performance of external private companies. So we were trying to think about how this might look in policing, and it was only when I read Super Forecasting, solid blocks of prediction, that I started to understand how the brain may work. Now, of course, if you at any point go into YouTube and you type in the Bayesian brain, you're going to get Professor Friston in some way. So that was my first introduction, and this was probably about 2 years ago, and I absolutely devoured all of his podcasts. I mean, everything that I could find. And that kind of linked in a lot with the LLM development. Obviously, we had the side-by-side. Active Inference seemed to be like picking up steam like crazy. And then we had the LLMs and the AI research picking up steam. And then you could see how the two were starting to like twist and merge. And there were some really good podcasts from Machine Learning Street Talk and Kurt J. Mungel's podcast, Theory of Everything. Well, we're talking really long form, like 2.5, 3 hour discussions on this stuff, and I was just absolutely immersed. And I started to think about how this has never been used in practice, like in policing. Like a lot of the time we go to these training sessions, you'd have some experienced practitioners talking to you about how they made decisions. We'd have decision-making models, and me with my relatively new academic brain was immediately going straight to Google Scholar and saying, okay, what's the empirical basis for these decision-making models? I know everyone's using them, but do we know if they work? Do we know if they speed up our decision-making? Are they better with those who've got better Bayesian building blocks? Are they not better? And when you start to look at these questions, you realize that there's almost no research to support police decision-making models. And the best stuff that I found on that is in Andy Clark's book, The Experience Machine. There's a full chapter on looking at police decision making. Anyway, I'm getting slightly distracted. How did I actually come to the paper? So there was one experience in my service, and I'm going to tell the story because it's in the paper, if that's all right, Daniel. Is that okay? Okay. So I was a newly promoted sergeant, and that's like a first line supervisor in the police. I had a team of about 15 police officers, and I was probably about 27, 28 years old. And I was out with one of those police officers who was new, and he was trying to build his confidence. So I said to him, look, Jamie, I said, we're going to go to all of the bad stuff tonight. So when the nasty incidents come in, we're going to go, and I'm going to see if I can work with you on building your confidence in these sort of like, these high risk situations. And he was all up for it. And then a domestic violence incident came in, and the male offender was still inside the house, and we knew that there'd been violence used because the person who rang it in was a neighbour, and the neighbour had said that she was severely injured and bleeding. So because there was a chance that it could get rough and we might need to make an arrest straight away, I thought this would be good for Jamie to go to. And he was a taser officer, and I don't know how like experienced you guys are, so I'll just let you know, but us police officers in England, we don't carry guns. Like there's probably about 5 or 6% of police officers that carry guns at the most, and a lot of them are only sent to incidents that may involve firearms. So the vast majority of incidents we go to, we have a baton, which is like a stick, and a spray, and they're the two bits that we've got to deal with it. Now, Jamie had just got his taser, and he was trying to build his confidence. So we turned up. There was a very injured lady on the sidewalk. She was pulling clumps out of her hair. She'd been clearly punched a great deal. Her face was an absolute mess. And she told us that he was still inside, the male offender, and that obviously he would be violent towards us as police officers. Now, if you read the paper, this may come across as if it was a kind of a one-off incident. It wasn't. You go to things like this all the time. On a busy Friday or Saturday night, I could go to 2 or 3 of these maybe. So this was very, very normal, nothing out of the ordinary. And I said to Jamie, okay, well, let's go and we'll wait for some backup, because he might be violent, this guy, and we'll go in and we'll see what we can do. He's obviously going to need to be arrested because of the damage that he'd done to the lady. And she said, no, I've got my 1-year-old upstairs and he's in bed. And the minute that she said that, like, we can't wait for backup, we have to go in because there's a chance that the child could be injured. So obviously that changed our decision making. And as we're working up to the front door, the door opens and this big muscly guy comes to the front door. And the thing that got me at that time, and again, I just have to stress, like, these were the very, very normal incidents. Like, we'd go to these all the time. There was something about this incident where I felt like my heart hit my stomach, big adrenaline dump, all of the prickles on my arm stood up, like my hair stood up, power erection, and up the back of my neck. And I remember looking at Jamie. Jamie didn't feel this, and I spoke to him afterwards. It was really strange because there was 2 of us presented with the same incoming sensory stimuli. I had a very different bodily reaction, and we talked about it afterwards. I mean, at the time, like I say, I was 8 or 9 years of experience. Jamie was like coming up to 2, so there was a big build-up of Bayesian priors in me for some reason. Anyway, let's cut a long story short. We ended up fighting with the male. He was very violent towards us. Really, really bad incident. And when we finally got him in handcuffs, as we got to the front door, we noticed that he'd dropped a knife, and he'd had the knife when I'd pulled him out of the doorway. Now, this is like one of those moments that you have in a policing career where you're like, your mortality punches you in the face, because had we gone inside or had we engaged him in a very different way, there's a chance that both of us would not have come away from that incident. And sometimes that like hits you, and it hit us both then. And Jamie got very upset. I remember it very distinctly. We walked into the kitchen. We had to go and check that the young lad was okay, and he was. And obviously, we got the injured party back into the house. But I remember doing like an immediate reflection afterwards and saying to Jamie, like, I have never had this severity of bodily reaction like that came on so quickly. And I've used the word salience to describe it in the paper, but there was something that was distinctly different. And I don't know what it was, but obviously whatever signals I was receiving, be it from the lady on the curb or from the male's behavior as we approached the door, there was something in me that told me introspectively. So it was an internal feeling that then triggered my cognitive processes to approach the incident differently. Anyway, that incident, obviously he went to court. He went to jail actually. So the incident itself, we managed to safeguard the lady and the son, which is always a good outcome. But for me, it really stuck with me for a couple of reasons. The first was that the bodily reaction that was so different was something that Jamie didn't receive at all. So there was no difference in him. He saw nothing of the evidence that I saw. And when I say saw, this is obviously, and again, I cover it in the paper, there's so much information that you're taking in these incidents, and it's in such a temporal window, that such a tight temporal window, that your ability to be able to affect the environment that you're in is very, very highly constrained, because you're only going to be at that incident maybe for minutes, if you're lucky an hour or over, depending on how busy the radio is. So you can't do what you would call any longitudinal niche construction. Your ability to mold or shape your environment when you turn up as a police officer is limited solely to the time that you're there. And because you don't know any of the people there, there's something going on in a police officer's brain, and again, this is discussed in the paper, that is very different to a normal work environment. So I'll try my best to give you an example. So if you work on a till in customer services, you have a very predictable way of living your day out. And of course, the unpredictability comes from the customers, but there's often a set of like procedures or protocols that you follow that enable you to deal with those people in a particular way. And that allows you to predict your work and hopefully comfortably do that. Now, when you're a police officer, you have the law. And this was interesting, actually, Daniel, because when we first had a chat about this, I think you put me in touch with somebody who was talking about the law as an agent of active inference, which is proper interesting stuff. And if we get time, like later on, it might be worth a discussion. But the officers are working within the law, so you've got bounds, if you like. You have boundaries that you work within, and there's particular actions you can take. But everything is so highly unpredictable. I'm not working with a till. I'm working directly with people. It's often in a very, very emotionally charged environment, because that's why police get called in the first place. You don't know any of the people that you're dealing with, and they're not coming to you asking for the same service. So it's not like you're going up to a shop and saying, I want to buy this again and again and again, which is the same thing that you'd get as a cashier. When we turn up, a lot of the time, people don't even want police there. So you come in as like a kind of alien, if you like, and there's often something that, again, it's like high emotions, everything's going a little bit crazy. Decision making of those people is normally totally out of the norm. You're trying to bring everything back within the norm. So if you like, the officer is like an agent of allostasis. We're trying to bring back homeostasis to the environment when you get there. But it's so messy and so difficult that you often end up making decisions that other people may look at and say, oh, why have they done that? That's such a strange decision. But if you've been, and I suppose in the paper when I go through it, if you've been in that particular situation a number of times before, and you have a good set of Bayesian building blocks that allow you to make improved decision making as a result of that experience, you may end up with improved outcomes. And I'm not going to say that you will, but you may. And it's a solid theory to back up good experience-led decision making. And there's lots of things that you can look at, and hopefully the paper towards the end might be able to just talk about some of those, and I can take the viewers through them. So that's the kind of background. The salience of this particular incident is the one that the paper is based on. It was so different to me during my police career that I needed something that explained it. This theory explains it in a lovely way. It's so nice. And obviously the kind of absorption of Karl Friston's work over time, and the reading of the books. I mean, Active Inference book by Thomas Pye. I know that you're doing a series on it, a reading group on it. It's brilliant. I would say it's a little bit hard going. Don't pick it up as your first book. Do some listening to the podcast first. Try and get your head around how it all works, and then pick up the book and go through it. It gets a little bit heavy towards the end. The Experience Machine's a really good introduction. That's another good one. Andy Clark talks about Active Inference, but it's not an Active Inference book. It gives you a much wider view on the cognitive neuroscience and how the Active Inference stuff is brought in. But I really enjoyed that. And then obviously, when I'd had this idea and I'd written most of the paper, I think I was at maybe 6,500, 7,000 words. I took the leap and I emailed Mr. Friston, and I just emailed Professor Friston with a massive chunk of humble pie and said, Professor, lovely to meet you. I feel like I know you because I've watched you a million times online. This is what I've written. What do you think? And then, to my surprise, he sent me back another 800 words or so with a very heavy endorsement. And I couldn't. I was a little bit in shock. It's one of those moments where I was looking at my computer and I was going, "Is that an email from? Oh my goodness!" And then I opened the manuscript and I was like, "Wow, okay, this is amazing." And then obviously a little bit more dialogue, and we chose to submit. But needless to say, and I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, because I don't have a background in maths or neuroscience, I'm fairly sure that those holes were evident in that first draft. And Mr. Friston did an absolutely amazing job of plugging them. So I guess that's the story behind the research, Daniel. Did that make sense? Yes? You good with that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Have you got any questions so far, or do you want me to just whip through the paper quickly?
Yeah, let's look through the paper.
Okay, cool. Right, I'll just go to share screen then. Okay. Okay, is that
Yep, looks
there?
good.
Are we? Okay, perfect. So I don't want to read the paper, only because I think everybody will die of boredom, but I will skip through the sections and explain to you my thinking. So I go very gently into setting the scene, talk a little bit about how police officers are often flung into what you would call vital high stakes situations, and this is elaborated on a little bit further, but it's that temporal nature of the decision making which I think causes very specific grooves in a police officer's brain. And I'm using the word groove because I think it's a really good analogy that kind of like explains the brain. It's not that we can't step out of the groove, but they help us make decisions. And I suppose that's in line with heuristics. It's actually in line with like hemispheric theory, like all sorts of like, and I talk about this later, like system 1, system 2 thinking. This is all quite well-established, good psychological research. It all like kind of melds together. It gives you a good little background. So I'll talk about a little bit of the history with regards to the hunch and what the hunch is. It's been described using a number of different terms. So we've got suspicion in here. This was done on research that was conducted when it comes to things like stop and search. And stop and search is such a contentious area of policing. So high impact when it comes to things like community tension, community confidence, trust, safety, legitimacy. A lot of it is linked with the use or the abuse of stop and search. So there's been quite a lot of study that's looked at the decision to stop and the decision to search, how those decisions are created, and often through ethnographies where academics have gone out with police officers and watched officers conduct their stops and their searches, and how they've then asked, after that's been done, like, how did you make that decision? How have you come to that decision to stop and search that person? What was going on inside your brain? And I've then introduced the domestic violence incident, which I've already discussed, so I'm not going to go through that. But I've just talked about this bit here where it says this scenario creates a fundamental question. How does an officer's body generate these hunches, these internal alarm bells, and what role do they play in navigating the experience of being a police officer? Now, they're not restricted to police officers, and I talk about this here, especially when it comes to things like medicine and public service based professions, armed forces, firefighting, etc. There's an excellent article, and if I could remember it, I would share it. But it was about a group of firefighters that went in there in the midst of, like, fighting this crazy big fire, and all of a sudden the supervisor just says, right, get out, get out, get out. And he grabs all his team and he pulls them out, and literally within seconds the floor collapses. Now, obviously, there's going to be no super particular salient detail that's made him do that. It's going to be a gathering of details which are going on often unconsciously in the midst of the fire that even him, I imagine, can't process in a way that's rational and deterministic. He can't say this led to this, and then this led to this, and then this led to this. It just, this overwhelming feeling came to him as a firefighter, and he said, no, come out quick. And as they came out, the floor collapsed. Now, that's an example of the hunch, but the hunch within a firefighting circumstance, it's the same thing. It's like a kind of overpowering feeling of intuition. So I talk a little bit about this here, and we talk about it being a little bit wider than stopping a vehicle. There is a discussion here of almost like the spectrum of what a hunch can be. Like, how does intuition present itself? There is some research coming very shortly from somebody called Emily Quinn at Cambridge. She's just done a PhD in something called the copper's nose, which again is the police hunch. And I didn't know about this until after I'd written it. But I know that she's done a data collection. I know that she's much more hot on the terminology and the neuroscience and the cognitive science behind this. And I know that her research is about to land. So just for the listeners, it's definitely coming. That's going to be a treat when it lands. But a hunch or a copper's nose when you're trying to find vehicles that may be up to no good, for instance. I'd been in cars with people who are very experienced police officers and they'd say something like, I want to stop that car, I don't like the look of it. Now I'm trying to learn, and my immediate question would be like, well, what do you mean you don't like the look of it? What is it about that car that's promoting this feeling of unease? And even the most experienced police officers, they can't answer that question. They'll say something like, oh, well, maybe it's the manner of driving, you know. But if it was the manner of driving, then I might have picked up on it. There's something else. There's something that's triggering. And I imagine they're heuristics, and they're heuristics that have built up over time. Again, it'll be Bayesian. There'll be tiny signs, tiny inputs, sensory inputs about a particular vehicle and the way that it's behaving that over time have led to the building up of this intuition. Now, that is a very, very small slice of what is intuition. A very, very big slice of what is intuition might come in the detective world. So if you're working on a murder case, it could be that you have a very particular feeling about one of the suspects, and that feeling may build up over time. Now, again, very, very difficult to explain. Why do you have a feeling that that suspect did or did not do it? Why is it coming? And again, those detectives, and I know I've worked with them, they can't explain it. There's something that's building up for them, and they can feel the hunch. The hunch isn't something that's visceral. It doesn't come into the piloerection kind of like, you know, like response to threat or response to stimulus that's severe. It's very, very slow creeping, and it leads to like this. It's almost like intrusive thoughts, you know, like they're very, very slow. They come in without, they're unbidden. There's no like kind of, I'm not happy with this. You know, this is not good. You know, it's uninvited. So the hunch can manifest itself in lots of different ways, from the kind of, I want to stop that car, I don't like the look of it, to something that generates over weeks or months. And again, it's very difficult to discern, like, where does that salience come from? We don't know. And that's one of the things that I think that should be looked at. And I discuss this at the end when we talk about where the research could go. So again, I take them through the incident which I've just discussed. And we talk a little bit about the background of intuition research, and then we talk about rational decision-making and intuition. There's a meta-study there from Wang et al. In 2017. He's talking about constructs. I think they are separate. They run upon the dual cognitive systems, system 1, system 2 again, emotional thinking, what you would call emotional thinking and rational thinking if you were being a Philistine like me. So, yes. And then I've very, very tentatively, and I have specifically used that word, I'll just highlight it there, tentatively, with this prior discussion in mind. The author posits a definition of a hunch with for the following discussion, which is an often unbidden, salient intuition experienced by a police officer that subsequently influences their actions. Now, when I say influences their actions, I don't mean that it specifically sends them in a particular direction. That direction can be anywhere, but it's the fact that it causes some sort of change in direction, or causes you to consider a change in direction that then in other words, it's instrumental. It's not something that just pops up and it can be dismissed. It does something. Now, there was some pushback a little bit on the definition. So words were added as we went in and through from the reviewers, who were amazing on the article. They were so cool. Gave lots of different additions or possible additions and talked about this. And we ended up with this inclusion of the word salience to kind of to describe a hunch, you know, like what? Well, it's the salience of the hunch. It's not like a normal hypothesis. Our brain is constantly generating hypotheses all the time. But there's something about this particular hypothesis, when it pops up, wham, it hits you. Okay, well, what does that hit feel like? Where has it come from? And why is it different to your normal train of thought? What is it that's made it pop out? And that then leads to the maths. Now, some of the narrative, probably half-ish of this is mine, some of it's Karl's, and Professor Friston went into a lot more detail than me. The equation that I put forward for surprise was tripled in length, So he went into a lot more. This was the Bayesian brain bit. So we introduced the Bayesian brain, if you like, the older research, and then we bring in the newer research, active inference and the free energy principle. And then Professor Friston added the detail in the equations here, and also the figures which have come in, which are the background, if you like, for these equations. How do these equations work and what do they say? What's the gist? So if I was to describe this, surprisal bounds, or the level of surprise that somebody operates within, a police officer is going to be very, very sensitive to boundaries of surprise. This is the hypothesis, essentially because, and I talk about this in the next section, which is about cultural niche construction, because they have very little control over their environments and they have very little knowledge of the people within them. I think that their brain will generate hunches in a much more sensitive fashion within those constraints. Okay, so essentially, through the gathering of experience, very temporally informed, if you like, work environment. If I go to a domestic and I walk into a domestic incident and the male and female are shouting and throwing things at each other, I have no discretion. I have to take action immediately, because there's harm that can take place at any point to either of the parties. Okay, so I have to take what is a very active role in that environment immediately, and therefore I'm constantly training my brain. I think personally, as a police officer, this is what I think goes on, to take action, and to take action decisively in order to reach desired outcomes. Now, in most people's daily business, they have lots of time to make these decisions, and as a police officer, you just don't, and that generates grooves. I think it generates grooves in the police officer's brain, and it leads to something which has come out in the ethnographic literature around policing called pragmatism. Now, it's described as a tendency to do over a tendency to think. So a police officer will often tend, I think, towards jumping into some sort of very active role in the environment, sometimes too quickly, way too quickly, you know. But I think that too quickly, and I'm going to use air quotes there, is Bayesian. I think that your brain is trained to intervene quickly in many, many cases, and it sets up grooves, and those grooves are very easy to fall into, and that presents risk, you know. So I'll give you an example. If I'm going to be controversial here, but this is where I think the research will be really cool. If, for instance, there is a drug problem within a particular neighborhood, and that neighborhood is high in ethnic minority, and it could be ethnic minority from anywhere. Okay, so it could be so in the UK, Albanian, for instance. Okay, or it could be black in London, or it could be Afro-Caribbean. There's lots of different ethnicities, but if there is a community which is heavy in a particular ethnicity, and as a police officer, you are constantly interacting in what will be highly temporal niche situations, normally violence related, with that community, that's going to influence the way that that officer thinks and reacts in other, maybe less temporally influenced situations. So I'll give you a physical example. If I am going to gang-related violence a lot, okay, and I'm dealing with victims that have been injured as a result of gang-related violence, if I do a stop and search in that same area, and I have been to all these previous incidents, there's going to be a building up of influence and experience in me, which is then going to change the way that I behave when I stop that car. So, and you will see this in the research. This comes out in a lot of the way that police officers are perceived when they're dealing with ethnic minorities, the way that police officers act. They're not the same, okay, when it comes to majority population interactions, okay. But I do think, and again, I'm pushing this theory way out from beyond my paper here. I do think that we can probably find some evidence of why that may be the case, and maybe prove empirically that the more incidents that you go to that could be highly temporally influenced, that may involve particular ethnic minorities could then change the way that you as a police officer operates on a much more wider scale with members of that ethnicity. Now, I don't think a lot of that's conscious, and I know because I've worked with police officers. I mean, I met one racist police officer in my entire service of 18 years. So I know people say, "Oh, the police are racist." You know, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it's way more complicated. I think that we have to really understand why police officers make the decisions they do over time for us to properly unpick this problem. I don't think it's something that we can turn the page on, and it's going to be years of good research, some of which is alluded to in Andy Clark's book. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit wide here, but all of this influences that conversation that I've just had. I'm not going to go into the detail, but that's the bit that is there. And we have this wonderful addition from him, which gives you the background to the theory from Professor Friston. Now, this is the section that, if I had the choice, I would have put a lot more words into. And this is the hunches and niche construction stuff, and you'll probably be able to tell that from how I've been talking about it today. But low surprise longitudinal relationships probably make up the vast amount of our interpersonal relationships that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, all of us, in general in the world, unless you're in somewhere that's very, very volatile. Mostly, they're going to be low surprise longitudinal relationships. So you're going to have more opportunity to mold the environment over time. Okay, so that's the active bit of the inference. Okay, so you've got this like kind of ability to interact with the environment then interacts with you, and you end up with this like kind of constantly like forward and back in between you and the environment. The problem is, of course, again with police officers, the ability to longitudinally change or influence an environment is just not there. I have an hour at most at the incident, and then I'm getting sent to another. And that may then cause, I think, this pragmatic lean into do rather than think. So that's the kind of like the what I'm getting to in this last part here before moving into the discussion. So there's a couple of questions that have come up here. I've mentioned the pragmatism here from Loftus. This is from the cultural literature. So what cognitive signals were generated by initial attendance that contributed to the hunch generation? When the Bayesian brain processes these signals, what is produced empirically during the process of active inference? What was the officer's qualia? So how does the hunch present into consciousness? Massively complicated, and I've even put it in the paper. We don't want to get into the consciousness debate because it's absolutely fascinating, but it's just incredibly complicated. So there are some things here that make that person aware, and this refers to that salience, which is in the definition. How were those qualia interpreted? So when the hairs on my arm stood up, how did I see the hairs on my arm standing up? So obviously you're going to receive the signal, but how do you interpret and then turn that signal into action? And these are questions that haven't really been answered yet within this particular area. And then this last one, which I think, I mean, it looks like an afterthought because it's one sentence, but it's not one sentence. It's actually really important. How did the officer justify this hunch in later court proceedings? And I have written hundreds, probably thousands of police statements over the years. And I know that reading back those statements, they will read very rationally. They would read super rationally. So my ability to rationalize my decision-making, post-decision-making, is way better than my ability to interpret a hunch rationally. And there's a big disconnect there. So you end up with a lot of, obviously, hindsight bias. If you stopped a car and you found some heroin, well, you stopped the car because you think that there was drugs on the car. But as mentioned earlier in the article, sometimes that hunch is non-specific. It's raised through experience. That's very, very different, really different. And I don't think that officers have got the skills to interpret the hunches well enough to make well-reasoned decisions. I think that they rely upon intuition much more than they say they do. And I know because I've been one and I've been around them. I know how these things work. So I just don't think that it's been researched well. And then as we get towards the end, we move into the theory support from that figure, and we posit a series of areas for future research. So we've got here longitudinal study on hunch development. So this is tracking the development of hunches in police officers as their career develops. I think this is super interesting, because when I talked about going up to that door in the domestic and Jamie not feeling anything and me having the most salient feeling I've ever had, there's something going on there, you know, like, so when does that start to happen? Like, when do police intuitions become so noticeable and powerful that people can see them and be able to act upon them, or be able to notice them and suppress them? Because even that is an interesting area. So if you are getting a hunch and you think that hunch may be informed through past discriminations, then surely you need to be able to suppress it. You know, you shouldn't be acting upon it. So if you think, for instance, that there's an element of discrimination in stopping a vehicle, you need to be able to notice that and stop that before it happens, you know, and it could be unbidden. And again, this is in the definition. So you haven't invited the hunch, it just comes, but you may know that there's not enough there for you to make that stop. There's not enough evidence. So something's going on, and you need to be able to see that and stop that happening. Comparative analysis with other professions. So this is looking at the generation of hunches, for instance, in the medical environment. Neurobiological correlates. So this was to look at neurobiological processes associated with hunch formation, the use of brain and body imaging techniques. This is probably way above my pay grade, but it would be super useful. And there is some precedent for it in very, very primitive studies in the 70s and 80s that look at things like heart rate and blood pressure over the tour of duty of a police officer, you know. But it'd be brilliant to see that advance. Much more advanced wearables, even looking at good scanning equipment. How are these hunches generated? It might even be one for the future, but we thought we'd discuss it. The impact of training on hunch accuracy. This is something that came from Professor Ken Pease. He was talking about training scars. Have you heard of training scars, Daniel? No. So training scars are where you constantly train in a particular way. Your grooves become very, very pronounced in the way that you approach similar incidents because you train so much. And then when an incident presents itself, your brain kicks you into those grooves, even though the grooves may be inappropriate. So they can lead to, so for instance, taking a shot because that's a shot you would have taken in training, despite the fact that that shot was non-justified. Or another one where there's not enough threat in the training scenarios. So because of that, you act in a much more slow and considered way when you need to act much more quickly. Both of those will be considered training scars. And again, so overtraining may suppress good hunch, intuition, or development. That's an idea. I'm not saying it's there, it's just an idea. So diversity, and we'll discuss this quite a bit today, insight into potentially gendered hunches. I mean, I'm super interested in that. I might look, this plays out when you look at the stats on things like stopping vehicles. It is different. It's different from a gender basis. There's something going on. No one's looking at it. I think this needs looking at. Operationalization of hunches in policing. So when, and I'm currently planning a study that looks at this now. So using both qualitative and quantitative methods, investigating the factors that contribute to the activation and follow through of hunches. But to do that, you have to be aware that a hunch is happening, and that's one of the things that we're trying to get our heads around. Like, how do we make officers aware enough that intuition is kicking in, and then when that intuition is kicking in, how do we help them describe it, and also help describe their decision making off the back of it? Because I think, again, if we go back to that pragmatism side, I think the hunch kicks in, the police officer makes the decision, but there's very little rational consideration of the connection between the hunch and the action. So that's something that I think we can look at. Comparative analysis of policing models, and I'll give you a really quick and dirty example of this. So in the US, obviously, it's a coercive policing model. In the UK, it's a consensual policing model. Both of those will change the way that hunches are generated. They will. So have you heard of the touching the tail light on police vehicles? So in the US, when a cop stops a car, as the police officer walks towards the car to speak to the driver, they touch the tail light. Now, there's lots of reasons for this. The first is that you leave your fingerprint and DNA on the tail light. Okay. But if you think about what that's doing in that officer's brain, the immediate consideration when he gets out of that car is, I could die and I need to leave evidence on this vehicle in front of me. Now, I have stopped thousands of vehicles in my police career, and I have never once thought that. And because I've never once thought it, I can hypothesize that the generation of hunches will be way different in terms of sensitivity to an American police officer's generation of hunches. Not least because the threat is so mitigated in the UK. The chances of me coming up against a firearm is almost nil. I have never seen a gun. I've never fired one until about 6 months ago. So like 18 years of service, and I've never carried and I've never seen a gun in a real life policing environment. That's going to change the way that I police. And I do think that there'll be a different operationalization of hunches as a result. And that's something that will be a fascinating study. And then this one here, this impact of technological support. How does the use of technology change hunch development? So for instance, and this is going to sound really weird, but let's just say a police officer is trained to record when a hunch is received. And it could be as simple as a tap on the wrist for a wearable or something similar. That could then help us correlate the types of incidents that police officers are at when they receive hunches. They don't have to explain them. It's just like, where are you most likely to get them? Where does your intuition manifest? And then we could look backwards at how it manifested and what it did. And then the last one, which is the public perception and trust. Possible to investigate how public perception and trust in law enforcement are influenced by officers' reliance on hunches. So I'll give you a quick example of this. If you rely on hunches to do stop searches, and that means that you do more stop searches, that may affect community trust within that particular community where you're conducting the stop searches. That then becomes reciprocal. So you rely on intuition to do stop searches rather than rational thought. That leads to a rise in stop searches, leads to a rise in arrests, and also probably a rise in much more like friction-based interactions with members of the public. Long term, that's going to lead to a breakdown in relationships and possibly issues with legitimacy. So how the public perceive the legitimacy of police actions. So that's just an example of where we could go on the big scale. This last one's a very macro like kind of level study, and some of these up here are much more personally based. And Daniel, I think that's about it.
Thank you. Thanks for overviewing it. I have some questions, and there's some great questions in the live chat. So,
okay, that sounds good.
Wow, many places to jump in. There's the fundamental tension with the possibly arbitrary or hard to explain yet intuitive and honed nature of the hunch, and about how the hunch has such a rich before, during, and after. There must be something like hearing the code called on the radio, and that setting a stage, like, I'm going to a comedy, I'm going to a horror movie, or it's this code, and that's all that is being passed through the blanket is just what code it is. And that's equivalent to like saying, what is your prior? What do you prepare yourself for, given that it's just this number or that number? And what are the costs and the sensitivities to like false positives and false negatives? So there's a lot of stages to investigate, like looking forward to the hunch and then looking back on it, where certain kinds of rhetoric or certain kinds of thinking are privileged or supported by legal proceedings. And saying something like, well, I just didn't think it was that way in the moment, could be the most honest statement, yet it might be seen as like almost malpractice. Okay, awesome questions from the live chat.
Yes, exactly right. Okay.
All right, here we go. I'll just read them basically in the order they came in. All right. So Susan asks, does hunch lead to epistemic foraging or pragmatic foraging? So let's just unpack that. In the expected free energy, decision-making, functional, different policies are evaluated in terms of their epistemic value, like expected information gain, and pragmatic value, which is aligning observations with your preferences. So how does that raising of the hunch then get pushed one way or another into seeking more information epistemically or directly moving to take pragmatic action?
So I think that was a very nice way of summing up a lot of the discussion where I talked about the lean towards pragmatism. The desire for control for a police officer when they first get there is like, it's almost primal. And I know that that's a big word to use, but they will, I think, tend to lean incredibly strongly into the pragmatic and then move into the epistemic. So, and if you think about this, this mirrors the court process. Like, if I turn up to an incident and there's threat within the incident, the first thing that I want to do is, and I know the word is awful because of the connotations it brings, but neutralize the threat. I want the threat gone, because while the threat is there, my intuition is going nuts. I mean, it overrides everything. So I'll give you a very quick, a practical example. If I'm in an incident where I believe that the male party in domestic violence is going to assault me or assault the victim while I'm there, right? My brain does not want to allow any epistemic foraging, none. There's a safety override, and the safety override is essentially make sure that this male is not going to assault you or assault the other person before we start asking questions. And that safety override is often the thing that people will look at and say, and this is what I meant when I talked about the difference between jurisdictions. So I would say that the safety override in the US is much more powerful than it is in the UK because of the threat that's there, because of the availability of firearms. So you're probably going to find where there's more firearms, the link towards pragmatic foraging is way higher, way higher. And then once that's done, neutralized, whatever word you want to use, then that's when the longer form questions and the much more like calm information gathering takes place. So really good question. There's definitely a lean towards pragmatic over epistemic, but epistemic will happen, and it just may come after the pragmatic. So there could be a like kind of hierarchy, if you like, of affordances because of the situation that presents. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like to give a kind of a non-policing example, it's like you dropped an object on the floor. If it was very surely just a soft carpet, you might feel around blindly, and epistemic foraging would have like a low risk. But if you strongly believed that there was like other sharp objects on the floor, you would be way more skeptical with just kind of reaching into dangerous locations.
That is, Daniel, can you answer my questions? Because that was way better than I just did.
Okay, next one. We'll each give a shot. Susan asks, how are police trained to avoid groupthink, i.e. not just follow the ones with improper force over motivations? So you're talking about individual cognition in that moment, but yet in that dyad encounter, there was like a collective intelligence component and a difference in hunches. So how does the group training and operating come into play?
Yeah, this is really interesting because there's nothing about the way that your brain behaves under pressure in any of the police training. Nothing. So, and I suppose, and this is a massive criticism, and I used to talk about this a lot because I was involved in the design of what's called the PQF in the UK, which is the Education Qualification Framework. And it was a very, very controversial project for me to be involved in, but it was about raising the initial level of education to degree level, bachelor's level for police officers. And one of the major drives is obviously to blunt to some extent the lean towards pragmatism and offer some priors for the making of police decisions that are better than those based just in practice. But this is a move away from what you would call like a kind of master apprentice model, which is and it's experience-based epistemic model now of police learning, into something that's much more a priori, which is your more traditional educative professionalized model. So are they taught to ignore groupthink? I'd probably say, well, there was no discussion of groupthink during my training, but I have to think back. I mean, my training was 23, 24 years ago, and I'm sure that things have progressed. Will it be good, informed, solidly evidenced stuff? Probably not. And I think in some cases, I think there may be some really good academics who will be out there working with particular forces, and they will be given this sort of training. But I think as a more general approach, I don't think it's there, and I think it's a massive gap. So really good question.
All right. Yeah. Very interesting. It's a team sport, team art / science. And so it has to be at least considered. How do officers share their hunches? Do they just raise their hand and say, I have a hunch? But that might be throwing a wrench into things in the moment. So how do the right communications surface? And then you have the radio, and you have the local communication. You have these different avenues of message passing, but not all messages lead to resolution of the situation.
So, Daniel, that's a really good comment. And we've just submitted a paper which is on the use of decision-making models in detective world. And we were talking about this, like, I was only on a murder inquiry for a year of my service. So, but I saw the way that the murder inquiries worked, and it is way more rational, and they invite hunches. So, like, your senior investigating officers will say, look, have any of you got any feelings about this? Please try and explain them. You know, or the other one where you just done an interview with one of the suspects, and one of the first questions that would come out isn't what did the suspect say, it's what do you think? How did it make you feel? You know, so there's a real space within the detective world for the discussion and sharing of hunches. Now, if I pick that same instance up and you drop it into uniform, because it's so temporally enforced, that you won't get chance a lot of the time to share your hunches. Like, so if I have a bad feeling about somebody at an incident, and this is that lean towards pragmatism again, I will want to make sure that I'm safe before I go anywhere. I won't share with the officer next to me, I have a bad feeling about that person. I want to take pragmatic action to go and try and deal with that bad feeling. So again, this leans back into that other question that we've just discussed. I would say that, so the sharing of hunches and the passing of messages is probably much more available within the long decision-making processes within detective work, and very poor within the incredibly short, temporally influenced decision-making of uniform. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it also makes me think about active inference and statistics are providing like a science of uncertainty and decision making amidst uncertainty. And yet, in many different domains, ranging from policing to law, science, there's kind of bespoke ways of dealing with uncertainties and different settings, even within the given field. Like different cases are going to have different treatments of uncertainties. And so there's now this dance or fusion to bring together those different treatments of uncertainty. I'm really curious how you see active inference and extended cognition in light of, even though I'm not very familiar with the details, the growth of policing technologies and surveillance technologies and the different paths that a given officer or department might have in front of them in terms of how they incorporate technology into their whole apparatus.
So there's definitely going to be a really, really big shift here. So when I left, this was 2.5 years ago, there were discussions 3 years ago about things like the integration of active heads-up displays. Okay, so when I'm at an incident, if I've got facial recognition, and it's running in the background, and it's passing me information that I don't have and didn't have. How will that affect my decision making? And that is, and I'm going to be really honest, really scary, because really scary and really beneficial. So I'll give you a quick example. I turn up at an incident. Again, I'm going to keep using the domestic incident because it's simple, and we as police officers go to them all the time. Okay, so it's and I keep calling myself a police officer. I'm not a police officer anymore. I'm a full-time academic, but a long time. So anyway, if I turn up at an incident and I have a set of glasses and my body cam on, my body cam's running at all times, so I know that there's some element of surveillance of my behaviour, and I know that whenever you look back at this incident, my decision making is going to be scrutinised. Okay, so when it goes into the court system, my behaviour will definitely be on show, and I know that as a result, obviously, I have to behave within the rules and the bounds and all that sort of thing. Now, there's a propensity, and I'm sure you know this, for police officers to do what's called informal working practices, where they essentially step outside the strict rules and laws and they try and take pragmatic decisions. So an example might be, if I stop somebody speeding, I might want to give them a warning. I might not want to give them a ticket. But speeding is technically a strict liability offence, so I should have to give them a ticket. And instead, I operate and I use discretion. I decide not to do it. I give words of advice, and that person drives off. Okay. With things like your heads-up display, if I'm walking towards that car and I'm wearing glasses that has given me full history, full driving history, including infractions, speeding, tickets, etc., just by looking at the number plate, and then when I get up to that driver's side window and the window comes down and my facial recognition tells me that this person has got previous for X, Y, and Z, assault, etc., is that going to change my decision making? 100%. Because what has the police officer got to deal with now? They have what's in front of them, and then they do that epistemic foraging. The extended cognition that would come from lifetime information during decision making is crazy. And I'll tell you right now, we'll be doing it before we understand whether it is a good thing to do or not, because that's what police do. They will jump in, probably. In fact, I'd be surprised if people weren't testing this stuff now. And the other thing, I think, I went straight to wearable stuff there, but there's other stuff that might help. So if I'm thinking from an interoceptive perspective, there's a really good study called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement Officers, and it was a police psychologist that wrote it, and he put heart rate monitors on police officers, and he showed that when you go into what's called a code 1 incident in the UK, which is an emergency incident, the blue lights are on, like you were talking about, the code, the passing of the information and the bodily reactions to it. If I'm going to an emergency incident, when I first start, you're incredibly aware interoceptively of what's going on. So you can feel your heart, your breath quickens, your periphery narrows, all of the normal stress reactions kick in, okay? Because you know that when you land there's probably going to be conflict of some sort and you're going to have to deal with it. Now, what the study showed was that very, very experienced police officers, so we're talking like 15 years, 20 years plus, when they were going to emergency incidents, they would say that those bodily reactions were not happening, but the monitors would say that they were. And this is super interesting because it may mean, you could say that the police officer has got more control over their interoception, or you could say the exact opposite. So they have dulled their interoception over time through exposure, continued exposure. And we don't know about the effects on hunches or the effects on general decision making in those different lengths of service, if you like. Now, if we go back to the extended stuff, imagine having a wearable that tells you this lifetime. That would be super interesting. Again, I'm like, maybe 5 years in the future here, but we're not a million miles away. There are well-being wearables that are ongoing now. I don't think they're being used for this purpose. Could they change decision making? Definitely. Will they? And in good and bad ways. Hey, I know this just needs a lot more research, this bit. this bit that you're discussing, loads more research. It just needs some proper good looking at, because it could be immensely beneficial. I can just see a million ways where it could also be quite damaging.
Wow. Yeah, the awareness of the hunch, and then there's one setting where the hunch is not aroused, which may be like a burnout situation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then yet also on the other side of, let's just say, like a stage performer, they still might get the physiological arousal, but they actually expect it. And so they don't attend to it, because this is the whole thing with ActInf is we're not paying attention to what we expect.
Yes.
And so they have a deeper experience layer that contextualizes the hunch, and yet that might obscure that hunch from being communicated, like to a younger colleague.
Yeah.
And yet communicating where and how the experienced professor or lawyer or officer feels in a situation is that ineffable experience transfer. And then I totally see these different paths with the wearables. One path where the boots on the ground are just reduced to an actuator in a decision-making system that they're not even a part of. Because it tells them, here's what you want to do to this car. Don't epistemically forage, just fulfill what the order is.
Exactly.
And then there's the epistemic engagement mode, and we can imagine like the family doctor asking somebody questions rather than like looking at their digital health record. And there's kind of there's a charming and an open-endedness to that. And yet in high reliability situations, people are going to be put into which lane are we going to take this doctor's office? Are we going to use digital health records? Or are we going to have slower, potentially noisier encounters just because people self-report that they like that more than the other way?
Yes. Yeah. And I, just as you got me thinking there's some really good studies that look at things like cancer diagnosis. And so, somebody comes in with a bad ankle and a doctor says, yeah, you need to go for this test and this test and this test. And they're unable to rationalize that. It's the same thing, but there's a much more. So if you look at a doctor's purpose, they're still going to be pragmatically based, because they're going to be trying to solve whatever problem is facing them. But their relevance realization has got so skilled over the years, and this some of the stuff that you were just talking about there, where there's lots of signals coming in that are just very, very efficiently dealt with subconsciously. And it may be about making that person aware of what that subconscious is doing in order to properly understand it. And this is what I was talking about with the hunch generation stuff. Because police officers don't interrogate the journey that led them to make the decision. They make the decision and then they rationalize it backwards. I think there's so much we could do here. Like, there's so much potential, because, and again, this is for improved decision making. This isn't like, so we're looking at improved outcomes here. We want to make policing better. How do we make it better? Well, I would say that increasing self-awareness about decision making is absolutely fundamental. You can't go anywhere. This is just like perfect, and the whole framework of active inference and the Bayesian brain, it just lends itself to this so well. Way better than the other theories that I'd explored, and some of which are in the article, like like the schema, the scripts, etc. But I love Ramsted's work on niche construction, and that's something I think that I would like to look at a little bit more. I think as time goes on. Sorry, my brain just went there towards the end. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, and
is there anything else, Daniel, question-wise? Have we got some more?
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going with the questions. Jeff asks, what overlap exists with military psychology? Zweibelson identifies active inference without directly referencing it in his recent book, Beyond the Pale, published by Air University Press. I don't know the book, but what do you think of the general question?
I don't, but I have. So I work in a security and defence academy. So I'm surrounded by military scholars. That's a really good question, and I will go and ask it for Jeff.
Cool. Okay. Dave asks, how do hunches align with hallucinations in deep learning?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I have to be honest, I mean, I've read some stuff on hallucinations, and I've listened to podcasts from Machine Learning Street Talk as well as some good discussions around it. I mean, they're anomalies, aren't they? But, and I suppose you're going to have a set of rules within the LLM that still allows them to be displayed in the same way that you're going to have a set of rules within the body that allows the hunches to come to the fore. I don't know is the answer to that. And I know that we don't properly understand hallucinations yet, but I mean, obviously we've got no consciousness in the deep learning machines, point of contention, but most people would say there's no consciousness there, whereas the hunch's ability to rise through the consciousness, so the qualia of the hunch, is the bit that makes it salient. And I think that salience would be lacking in any element of LLM deep learning based work, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, Daniel?
Yeah, I think another complementary way that I thought of that question is the hallucinations, let's just say in image output. You say represent this, and it makes a full resolution image that is non-factually based, and so people sometimes refer to it as a hallucination. So whereas the outputs of that are in terms of observations that are just factually ungrounded, the hunch, it's not like it's not a visual phenomena. It's not like there's a new visual overlay or a sensory
I see what you mean.
prediction. It's actually something slower that is kind of like an upwelling of something that is salient because, as you pointed to, it's slower, it's interoceptive, it's affective. It's not modifying like what we see, smell, hear in the way where when people talk about hallucinations as outputs of machine learning models, they're usually talking about the outputs.
It might do that though, Daniel. That sounds really weird, but I think it may to some extent do that. So, and I'm just thinking about how that might be the case. So if I'm at an incident, I'll give you another very quick example. So we went to conduct a mandatory sectioning, which is a horrible incident, and I hate them, but it's essentially taking somebody into full-time mental health care. He was a serious schizophrenic who was a danger to others, and we went to basically take him into custody so that he could go to the hospital, because he wasn't refusing to take his medication or show up for his appointments, and it was care in the community, etc. And he had attacked somebody. And I was in that room for probably 1 minute, and I was telling the doctors to get out because I knew what was coming. And if somebody had, and this is what you're saying, where it changes the way that you see. Well, it does, because it changes your relevance realization as the intuition kicks in and becomes stronger, then your focus changes visually. So you're going to be filtering out much more of the side, if you like, and focusing in on what would be considered the threat, whatever the threat may be. And in this case, I mean, he was holding a knife down the side of a sofa and he was about to attack us. And for some reason, something about that incident, again, highly salient feeling, it then changed the way that I saw, it changed the way that I interacted, communicated, changed the way that I dealt with my externals. And I suppose you could call them variables. So I wanted the other people out of the way, because that would then give me greater, that would give me less to think about when the conflict actually happened. So I would probably say there's a parallel there. I think that it can affect the senses, and I imagine that. No, I quite like it. It's an interesting thing to think about. That's
I saw in the paper you cited the quantum reference frames and Chris Fields' work. So that just makes me think, walking down a street, one reference frame is just like, oh, there's people milling about. And then another reference frame, whether this is paranoid or
Yeah.
not, is like they're in formation to circle me, or
Yes.
somebody is shaking a
Yes.
little bit in their hand and it's like, oh, maybe they have essential tremor. Maybe they're
Yes.
nervous. Maybe
Yes.
they're about to do this. And so that doesn't change the photons hitting the retina,
That's
but
right.
it changes our framing, and that is what is actionable. And a more cognitively informed law and legal system could have a more
Agreed. Yes, you're
accurate
right.
grasp of
Yes, you're
this.
exactly right. Yeah. Yes. Very good. I've told you, you're way better at this, Daniel. Like, you wrap up my words, and it just comes out in a much simpler way. Very good.
We're cruising together. Um, well, where are you going to go in your continuing directions here? Like, what are you going to do with this now that you have the Frontiers paper?
Okay. So there's a couple of things that I want to do. I want to test whether current decision-making models in policing that are used widely in many different countries are useful for the processing and understanding of police hunches, because I think that they are accountability models and not decision-making models. So that's something that I want to look at. But I suppose the more relevant study will be researching the qualia of the hunch. So within different settings, especially within uniform, I'm very interested in it because of its contact with legitimacy as a whole, like how police are perceived. I want to know how uniformed officers receive, understand, process, and then act upon hunches. The study that I have in mind is this is going to sound really weird. I want to do like a kind of personalized dictaphone, like a narrative account. So essentially, when a police officer in any corner of the world makes a decision on the basis of a hunch, that is then narrated into this kind of like repository, and we use that repository as a qualitative evidence base to research how the hunch is processed and then acted upon. That's what I'm thinking. So I'm currently in the process of getting funding, and I'm hoping that I can secure it. And if I can, I'd like to run it as this is going to sound really strange, but a voluntary worldwide study. So I don't care where you're a police officer. I want you to take part, and we look at how you are receiving on a daily basis your minor hunches from I want to stop that car through to those like kind of heart hitting your stomach, piloerection, high threat hunches that totally change the way that you see the incident in front of you. So that's the next step, I think.
That makes me think of Arrowid, which is a repository of alternate states of consciousness, mostly based upon substances.
Yes,
So
psychedelic ones. Yeah.
yeah, it's another,
Yeah.
but it's a voluntary self-report, and that sounds very cool and voluntary.
I'm hoping that's the plan. But I'm hoping that once I get the funding, that will be a green light. And obviously, in the meantime, I mean, it's been so cool talking to you, Daniel. And I know that the community is quite tight in and around the Active Inference Institute. So if anybody has been listening, or if anybody listens to this in the meantime, if you've got any cool ideas or you want to ask me any questions, look, just email me. I love to talk about this stuff in general. And the discussion, I know that we mentioned it right at the beginning, but even the discussion where we talked about the law, I've got a theory that I've spoken to a professor about. I'll just throw this out there just to finish off. I think that people may call the police when the surprisal bounds are breached, and they want the police to be an agent of return. So essentially, the police become an agent of allostasis to return to homeostasis for that person. Now, what that gives us, and it's something that we don't have, is a general theory of police contact, and it allows us to see how different communities may call the police based on their different surprisal bounds. So, for instance, in high chaos communities, their sensitivity to surprise is going to be much higher than those that are in, much lower than those that are in very, very structured, gated communities, for instance. And this could lead us to some really interesting research, but it's something that is very much in the background of my brain and something that I'm thinking about a lot, reading about a lot, and hoping that maybe over time I can start to develop it.
Awesome. Thank you, Gareth, for connecting these critical areas and bringing ActInf in. And it's just exciting to hear where it's going.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone who's actually managed to listen to me to drone along for this long. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Oh, there's great comments in the live chat. So thank you. Talk to you next time.
Okay. Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.